Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. This is my, obviously, Friday session of Morning Musings, and we call this Responding to the Critics because most of the time on Friday mornings, I do book reviews, I respond to articles that have been written against covenant eschatology, and overall, I try to respond to what people consider to be valid objections against covenant eschatology. And, pardon me, I am currently examining a paper written by Andrew Perriman, man for whom I have a great deal of respect. I appreciate, I appreciate his writings. I appreciate his books. I do differ with him tremendously on a paper that he wrote in 2015 entitled Why Babylon of Revelation Was Rome, Not Jerusalem. And I have to tell you, I've hinted at this before. As much as I admire Andrew Perriman and appreciate and respect his work and his erudition, his scholarship, some of the arguments that he sets forth really strike me as being illogical, and they're not solid, they're not sound, they're not even properly historical in my estimation of things, and that's where we're at this morning. Now, before we get into that, I promised you that I would be having a really good book special for you for the month of July 2024, U.S. orders only. I apologize for not doing this earlier. Okay. But for the rest of this month, July 2024, U.S. orders only, my two books, The Elements Shall Melt with Fervent Heat and The Last Days Identified. Now, the reason I'm offering these two particular books is because of the widespread, it is the dominant view that one of these days, in fact, I was reading just this morning The Beliefs of the Early Church, and by Evans, I think. Anyway, just got the book in, and he was chronicling how the earliest writers, or at least second, third, and fourth century writers, all believed in the end of human history, the destruction of the earth. And that's the view I was raised with. That's the view I believed. And that goes right hand in hand with the idea that the Christian age is the last days. Well, these two books dispel those notions completely. Okay? If you were to buy these two books separately, you would be paying over $40. Okay? But once again, July 2024, U.S. orders only, total delivered price $25. Okay, so that's going to save you $15. Actually, it's going to be over $15. But anyway, take advantage of that. Go to my website, donkpreston.com, BibleProphecy.com. There's a wonderful tab right up the very top, and take advantage of this really, really great two-book special. Now then, back to Andrew Perriman's article, 20 Reasons Why Babylon of Revelation Was Rome and Not Jerusalem. And I must say that this is an example of what I mean when I say I'm somewhat amazed at the illogical nature of some of the, quote, reasons that Dr. Perriman gives. In his point number 11, and remember, I'm not covering every single point that he raises simply because I've already covered those points in my review of the book, The Future of Rome. Okay, so his reason number 11, both 4th Ezra and 2nd Baruch, writing after AD 70, reflect on the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans by implicitly comparing Rome with Babylon. For example, but the king, quote, but the king of Babylon will arise who has now destroyed Zion and will boast over the people, and he will speak great things in his heart in the presence of the Most High, unquote, from 2nd Baruch 67 and 7. Ezra depicts the impending destruction of Babylon and condemns Asia for having shared, quote, in the glamour of Babylon and the glory of her person. Asia has imitated that hateful harlot in all her deeds and devices, unquote, 4th Ezra 15:43 to 48. The parallel with Revelation 18, 9 through 10 is clear. Pardon me. And he quotes Revelation 18, 9 to 10. The kings of the earth who have committed sexual immorality and lived in luxury with her will weep and wail over her when they see the smoke of her burning. They will stand far off in fear of her torment and say, Alas, alas, you great city, you mighty city, Babylon, for in a single hour your judgment has come, unquote. Well, the reason I find this somewhat disingenuous and certainly untenable is because Ezra and Baruch were Jewish books. They were not Christian books, meaning they were not written from the Christian perspective. Okay? And let's look a little bit closer at this. The Jews would very much associate Rome as Babylon. Why? Well, because Babylon to the Jew represented and symbolized what? Bondage. But the great question is, did the early church see Rome as representative of bondage? No. The answer is an unequivocal no. You, pardon me, you cannot find in the New Testament a clear-cut statement, implication, or idea that the first century Christians considered Rome to be a symbol for bondage. On the contrary, you find the idea that Jerusalem and the Old Covenant represented bondage, even represented Egypt. In Galatians chapter 4, Paul told the allegory of two women and two sons, representative of the Old Covenant and the New, the Old Covenant people and the New Covenant people. Now, who is the woman and the son, or that is to say, the covenant that represented bondage? Well, he says Hagar represents the Jerusalem that now is and is in bondage with her children. Do you catch the power of that? Now, this was written probably 49 AD. So here is Paul saying that Old Covenant Jerusalem represented bondage. And by the way, he is talking about Hagar. Well, who is Hagar? Hagar was an Egyptian. Genesis chapter 25. What did Egypt represent? Bondage. So Paul uses two very clear images, symbols of bondage. He uses Hagar, representative of Egypt and bondage, but then he very clearly refines that focus and says that Hagar and Ishmael represented Jerusalem, that from his temporal perspective, the Jerusalem that now is and is in bondage with her children. Then, and by the way, he says, cast out the bondwoman. So this city of bondage, this Egypt, and the reason that's important is because the great city, i.e. Babylon, was spiritually called Egypt. Well, guess what he's doing? By referring to Hagar as Jerusalem, He is thereby, in really good, typical Jewish rabbinic midrash, he is saying that Jerusalem represented spiritually Jerusalem. But then, in a non-metaphoric way, he says that Hagar represented the Jerusalem that then was and is in bondage with her children. So we have two images that Revelation reflects directly on bondage and Egypt, and Paul refers them specifically to Old Covenant Jerusalem. Then, in Galatians chapter 5, in writing to the Christians who have come into Christ, they have departed, they are in the process, I should say, of departing from the Old Covenant and Old Covenant Israel. There's a transition period going on, but nonetheless, they're being pressured to go back under Torah, to go back to their former Old Covenant ways. And he says to them, stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Christ has made you free. Do not be entangled once again in a yoke of bondage. What is bondage here? It's the Old Covenant. So the great question then becomes, does Paul have a different concept of a city of bondage from that envisioned by John? Pardon me. That's one question. Now, since Paul and John taught the same gospel, according to Galatians chapter 2, they shook hands that they taught the same gospel and the same message. That question becomes very, very serious, and it's a very legitimate question. So the question therefore becomes, so here is Paul in Galatians referring to Jerusalem as the city that represented bondage and that represented, metaphorically, spiritually, Egypt. Here is John speaking of, quote, Babylon, that represented, metaphorically, Egypt and bondage. Oh, but that's not all. In Galatians 4, the children of the bondwoman, Ishmael, representing Old Covenant Israel, was persecuting the New Covenant saints when Paul wrote. As it was then, that is in the days of Abraham, when Ishmael laughed and persecuted Isaac, Paul said, as it was then, the children of the flesh persecuted the children of the promise. Well, what says the scripture? Cast out the bondwoman. So Old Covenant Israel, and by the way, this speaks eloquently and powerfully to the question, when was Israel and when was the old law cast out? People tell me all the time, well, Israel and the old law was cast out at the cross. The old law ceased to be binding at the cross. Well, according to Paul, the old covenant was not going to be cast out, or had not yet been cast out, when he wrote in 49 AD, and Israel and the law would be cast out. Why? For persecuting the new covenant saints. So, this issue of the continuing validity of the law, and I'm currently corresponding with someone on YouTube, and they say, well, yes, the old covenant continued to be valid, but not binding. I'm sorry, folks, that's double talk. That's double speak. If the law was valid, it was binding. The writer said that the law would continue standing, having legal standing is what the Greek word stasin means, until the time of Reformation. The time of Reformation is the time of salvation. but the time of salvation is the second coming of Christ. Hebrews chapter 9, 10 and 28. Let me say this again. It is doublespeak to say, well, yes, the law continued valid, but not binding. And then this individual says, well, who is it binding on? No, that is the question. It was binding on Old Covenant Israel, who had not yet been cast out. And it was binding until it was all fulfilled. Matthew chapter 5, 17 and 18. And so, you get a word salad from individuals trying to draw a distinction between it was valid but not binding. That's word salad. That's nonsense. And it makes nonsense. So, back to the point here today, when Andrew Perriman says, well, both 4th Ezra and 2nd Baruch, writing after AD 70, reflect on the destruction of Jerusalem, they refer to Rome as Babylon. Now, by the way, in my book, Who is This Babylon?, I address this issue in depth. Because the very first time I read that argument, I'm going, whoa, I didn't know that. But it immediately dawned on me, well, so? I'm sorry. I mean, no disrespect so whatsoever. But why would I say that? Why would I say, what's your point? Here's the point. Ezra and Baruch, that's 4th Ezra, and Baruch were Jewish books. They were not Christian books. Now, some claim they had some Christian interpolations in them. That's not the point. Let me reiterate this. You have to catch the point of this. Andrew Perriman says, 4th Ezra, 2nd Baruch called Rome Babylon. Yes, they did. But the point of it is, they were Jewish books, not Christian books. And the Jews and the Christians had two totally different world views in regard to bondage and the city of bondage. Paul in Colossians chapter 2 especially writes about the elements of the world. And just like in Galatians chapter 4, when we were still children, we were in bondage under the elements of the world, the stoicheia to cosmou. So both in Galatians, and remember now, he's already described the bondage. Well, in Galatians chapter 4, he says, well, I fear for you because you're in bondage to the elements of the world, because you observe days, weeks, months, and years. Where did that come from? Torah, the law of Moses. But in Colossians, he says virtually the same thing. And he says that, and he's saying that prior to becoming Christians, they were subject to the elements of the world. Now, for those people who want to make elements, the elemental table, earth, wind, fire, water, etc., you got a problem here. Paul is saying that the Christians had been subject to the elements of the world. But, by the way, he says those elements were passing away when he wrote. You get the point I'm making here? In Colossians and in Galatians, both, we have Paul teaching bondage to the law. Do you suppose that that was the view of Baruch and Ezra? No, it was not. So once again, let me reiterate, this is so critical. Andrew Perriman is appealing to the worldview of the Jews and conflating that with the worldview. He is conflating the ideological, theological view of the Jews with the ideological and the theological view of the Christians, but those two views are poles apart. They were poles apart in the first century and growing disparate by the day. And so I suggest, and by the way, he follows that up with a reference to the Sibylline oracles, and he says Peter, in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 13, almost assuredly referred to Babylon, again in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 13, as Rome. And he cites Eusebius. Now, this is 4th century. Eusebius claimed that Peter composed it in Rome itself. Eusebius is speculating. There is no concrete proof. Now, there's all sorts of tradition, mind you, but there is certainly no biblical proof that Peter was in Rome when he wrote this epistle. By the way, I wrote an article on this some years ago, and it's on my website. So go to donkpreston.com, BibleProphecy.com, and in the search bar, just look up, was Peter in Rome, or 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 13. And you'll see the article, free of charge, completely. There are lots and lots of reasons for rejecting the idea that Peter was in Rome. There are many reasons why Peter was writing from Jerusalem. And consider this as I close out this morning. I believe that we have very, very strong reason for believing that Peter was writing after. I want you to catch the power of this. There is very strong reason for believing that Peter wrote after the book of Revelation. Okay? One of the reasons, and I'm running out of time here, but one of the reasons is that in Revelation chapter 3, Jesus promised the church at Philadelphia, I will deliver you from the wrath that is about to come. Now, who's John writing to? The 7 churches of Asia. Who is Peter writing to? The churches of Asia. Jesus said in Revelation, I'm going to deliver you, the church at Philadelphia, from the wrath that is about to come. Peter, in 1 Peter chapter 5, 14, says, Brethren, think it not strange concerning the fiery trial that is in your midst. Folks, he's writing to the same churches. Revelation, wrath is coming, about to come. Peter, wrath is in your midst. To me, that's awfully powerful evidence that Peter wrote after Revelation. Now, if Peter wrote after Revelation, then is that not really strong, or at least suggestive? Since Peter is dealing over and over and over again with Jewish persecution, and he even indicates that the end of the millennium was near, when he says, be sober, be vigilant, for your adversary, the devil, walks about roaring, seeking whom he may devour. That's Revelation 20, verse 8 and following. Peter says Satan's already there, roaming around. He's angry, has great wrath. Okay, out of time on that, but I think you can see the suggestive power of saying that Peter wrote after Revelation. And since Peter is focused so much, he's writing to the diaspora, for crying out loud. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 1 and 2. The diaspora of whom? The Jews, who are being persecuted. But they're not being persecuted by Rome. They're being persecuted by their fellow brethren. There are all sorts of indications of that throughout the book of 1 Peter. And I produced a multi-video series, 15 lessons, on 1 Peter and why it was written from Jerusalem, why it was written to Jews who had become Christians, why it was written concerning the fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel, and then including the Gentiles into that salvation. It's available from my website. Take advantage of it. I think you'll find it really challenging. I think you'll find it impressive at the evidence to suggest that Peter was writing after the book of Revelation and is focused on Jewish persecution. Hey, I'm out of time. Thank you so much. I hope you can see that Andrew Perriman's appeal to Jewish writings calling Rome Babylon is antithetical and is contrary to the idea of Christians calling Rome Babylon. No, Christians believed that Jerusalem was Babylon. Out of time. Thanks for joining me. Hope to see you tonight with Mike Sullivan on Preterist Apologetics. Hope to see you there.